Booyakasha, as was popular to say in the late 90s. We have episode 153 of the Scottish Liberty Podcast. We're going to talk about Michael Moore's documentary, Planet of the Humans. And here to discuss that with Tam and I is the fantastic Nick Pecone. He is the co-host of Free Markets Green Earth, the biggest, if not the only, free market oriented show on environmentalism. And he originally contacted me to say, hey, have you checked out this movie? And I said, well, I better check that out. And then Tam, did you listen to it after I mentioned it on Sunday? Or had you seen it already?
I think I watched it on either Sunday evening, I think it was Sunday evening, Sunday night, possibly Monday morning at some time. But yeah, I watched it. And the first thing I'll say about it is I thought it had a pretty cool soundtrack.
All right, okay, yeah. There was
you had King Crimson on there. You had even Black Sabbath at one point. There was a whole lot of kind of ambient, kind of spacey stuff going on. Thought I heard some Tangerine Dream in there at one point, but I could be wrong. So that was pretty cool. I thought it was a well-made documentary. I enjoyed it. It done all the things that a Michael Moore documentary done. You know, it pushed all the buttons. How accurate it was another thing. I mean, the thing that struck me is that I thought, well, these are all things that, you know, these guys are late to the party on this, because these are things that people on our side of the spectrum, if you could call it that,
the autistic spectrum,
all spectrums, and the spectrum, and we've been banging on about this shit for the last 20 to 30 years and pointing out continually what a giant waste of money some, if not most, of these sort of green energy projects are. But as it turns out, some of the stuff he was pointing out was just that. It was like 20 years maybe out of date. But we were banging on about it years ago. We're still going on about it. But the lefties are now just, some of them on the left, and including Michael Moore apparently, has just cottoned onto this and has. So there was some good points. The bad points for me were it seemed intensely anti-human. So that element is still there, and of course it wouldn't be a Michael Moore-backed documentary if it wasn't completely anti-capitalist as well. Although it did kind of make a distinction in there. It did mention a kind of capitalism, which was, corporate, sort of corporatism. That's what it was hinting at.
I was hearing some left-wing critics of the movie criticize it for not being anti-capitalist enough.
Right.
Nikki P., welcome to the show. What made you reach out and tell me to watch this documentary?
Well, for me, I was actually incredibly, as a guy who hosts an environmentalist podcast, it struck me on a couple levels. I think my general feelings about it, I'm excited about it. And the reason I'm excited about it is actually for all the reasons that most of us hate it.
Right.
It is absolutely 100% anti-human. The technology and like some of the issues it talks about are probably more like 5 or 6 years old, which is the one criticism that a lot of the left has on it. But the actual problem is that, so it's about 5 or 6 years old, but all of the premise still stands. Like those technologies are maybe a little bit better, but we're talking like 20 or 30% efficiencies better, not 95 to 100% where they're still feasible.
Right.
And while you mentioned the economic impact of those technologies, I mean, as a card-carrying environmentalist, like the thing that actually bothers me more is less that they're expensive than they're horrible for the fucking environment. Sorry.
No, sorry. We can.
Yeah.
You
can curse as much as you fucking want
on this program.
Okay. I'm not used to being just I'm not allowed to, so that would have been weird. But the fact of the matter is like all those technologies are awful for the environment. Like, well, even if they weren't more expensive, like they generally use the same fossil fuels, as the movie points out, but the mining that we do, the rare earth minerals to create the batteries for any of those technologies is just catastrophic to the planet. Like, I have odd feelings about the fact that my cell phone has to use those things, let alone the fact that like we'd have to have extra giant ones to use any of those technologies. You know, what does that do to, like, if you, I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of a rare earth mine in China where they get the materials to make those batteries, but literally it looks like Mordor.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the most awful place on earth.
In fairness, Nick, just to put the counter claim, I mean, most of the environmentalists who criticised the movie have said, well, look, you know, that's a price you pay with fossil fuel technology as well. If you build an oil refinery or you build a natural gas installation, you're still causing a carbon footprint. You're still creating, you're still using steel, you're still using all sorts of products that you have to mine. Or
absolutely right.
Yeah, so the initial costs are still there with fossil fuels, but the bonus, they say, with this is that once it's created, then the carbon footprint's considerably lower.
Well, but that's actually wrong, because
Okay.
I still have I still have the carbon from the fossil fuels. That doesn't go away.
Yeah.
But then I have the carbon from that, plus the rare earth mining, plus the horrible disposal, because none of the things are efficient enough to use more than 20 years, and then I'm left with all of this crap I've then got to bury in the desert. So like,
right.
You're not. The problem is that you're not getting away from the carbon in the first place. Like, you're still using that plus all the other stuff. Like, it's just you're stacking, and people don't realize that. The thing that I absolutely loved about it is because, like you said, guys like us, we've been pointing this out for years. Like, it's people, I think, we're sold the false bill of goods, and I, as someone who's a former lefty, I get that. So, watching what we consider, obviously, with the premise of this, a hardcore leftist kind of have a come to Jesus moment and realize that happened. That is incredibly important to me. Now, the thing that I actually think is probably better for us than for them is that how hardcore this person is. I think that anyone who is on the fence about technology like this, they're going to come out and see that this movie created by a guy who's alternative is, well, we should just scrap this whole humanity project. I don't think people are ready for the let's scrap the humanity project.
Yeah.
And so, as opposed to pushing more people to the left, I see more people going, you know what, if this is the case, maybe those guys weren't so wrong on the other side. Because like, if it was like a small jump for his logic, that maybe he might have like a better premise. But it's not. It's a huge leap to, well, these particular technologies don't work right now, so let's just wipe out humanity. We clearly, that opening line where like he had that question he asks when it actually shifts the movie from the interview where he's interviewing people about it. I can't remember the specific line, but he basically just asked the question, maybe our time is up. Should we just, kill ourselves as a species? And I stopped the movie the first time I watched it going, did he really just ask that question? Is that something a sane person, a rational human being can ask? And like I put the movie down and I messaged, like I wasn't even gonna finish the documentary. I'm like, oh my god, like that's an insane thing to say. And then my partner's like, hey, I started it. Are you watching this? I'm like, I wasn't gonna, but like, okay.
Right. I think one of the things the critics of the movie got right was that it seems to offer no solutions, and it just hints very strongly at wiping a bunch of us out. Let me just ask you a couple of questions. There's quite a few articles claiming that one of their major gaffes was they went and talked about a solar panel in Australia, which they were so proud of, but that only had this 8% inefficiency figure, and even the guy that was meant to be championing this was like really honest and frank about how it could barely. electrify. It could barely power any houses. Easy for me to say.
Wasn't it like
But
32 houses in a year?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
they
something
it's supposed
ridiculous
to be
like that.
100.
A lot of the articles are criticizing that, saying solar panels now installed in more than 2 million American roofs typically operate at 15 to 20% efficiency. So that's like at least double. Can you comment on that
Well,
at
can I
all?
just before and Nick comes back
Yeah,
in,
go for it.
can I just add something quickly to that? As far as I read, there's a claim that solar panels take more energy to produce than the generator. Okay, it says here that this is just one website. God damn it, where are we? Yeah, the film claims green energy is not replacing fossil fuels and that coal plants cannot be replaced by renewables. To disprove this claim, we need look no further than Australia, where wind turbines and solar panels have significantly reduced their dependence on coal. In South Australia, for example, the expansion of solar and wind has led to the closure of all coal-fired power stations. The state now gets most of its power from solar and wind, exporting its surplus to Victoria when its old coal-fired power stations prove unreliable on hot summer days. What's more, a report released this week by the Australian energy market operator IEMO said with the right regulations, renewables could at times supply 75% of electricity in the national electricity market by 2025. That's the claim made by that. This is called theconversation.com.
And that's a hell of a claim.
Right. Okay.
You know, I can say pretty much anything. Yeah, we got another 5 years. I'm sure it's like those people. We're definitely going to have a vaccine for the COVID and by December. You know.
Okay.
You know, on an untested technology that's never worked before, on a type of virus that's never worked before. You can throw word salad at the wall and make anything stick if you wanted to, I guess. The fact of the matter is so even at 75% efficient or 75% of the energy that it did before. Okay, so you're at 75% of the energy before, then you still haven't hit the energy demands of your own nation. So what is the point you're trying to make? And even if that's the case, at what cost? You know, it's one thing for us here in the first world to sit there and say, well, we're willing to take it on the chin and make our energy, you know, less efficient, more costly.
Right.
But I can't think of a single thing that anyone could say that's more racist or bigoted towards other nations of the world that don't have that luxury. Sure, you and me can probably spend a little bit more and, you know, maybe tighten our belts to pay for energy, but Africa and China sure as hell can't. So how insensitive is it to us as people just completely overlook those nations when we have to think about, well, what can people pay for energy? So do we now just have to, you know, say, well, those countries can use fossil fuels because they need to, so they can get to where we are. Well, China's a gigantic emerging population, and most first world countries have kind of we're already moving in the direction that we're supposed to be moving because we care about this stuff.
Yeah.
But their population's huge. If you just ignore them when we're talking about this, what's the point in like doing that to any of our other nations? So we're crippling every first world industrialized nation so that China can take advantage of all of us. Like they're not pumping any less carbon in the world. That's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah.
So it's just very frustrating to see how the ways that people think about it.
Yeah.
Like I said, just point out the fact. Okay, so 75% of the energy, which means you're still going to need to find 25% somewhere, or you're changing the way your people live.
Right.
So
yeah, and I mean, obviously, what that article doesn't say as well, or mention, is how much it's being subsidized. And I thought there was a key moment for me in the film. I mean, I thought the movie, on balance, was good in the sense that we can go on as much as we like about this stuff, and nobody really on the left or who's into this kind of stuff is listening. If this makes it, you know, at least some of the people on that side of the divide, if we can call it that, start listening, because it's that only Nixon could go to China thing. The very fact that Michael Moore has these leftist credentials may make some people actually sit up and take note. And I think it's a win-win for us in the sense that, if if the film is in the best part true, then that's good for us. If the film is extremely inaccurate and full of inaccuracies and, you know, overblown and sort of convoluted and contrived, then that only goes to show what we've been saying about Michael Moore for the last 20 years as well. So it's kind of a win-win. There was a key moment in the movie for me where he interviewed one looked like an Indian woman. When I say Indian, I mean South Asian. And she highlighted the subsidies. She went, every single one of these industries that are doing supposedly well are being massively subsidized with state money. And that's what's given them the veneer, at least, of success.
Well, and that's not beyond me, I'll tell you that much. When you're watching the movie, I'm thinking about, I remember when I was in electrical school, we went and we actually looked at one of those wind turbines, which, by the way, are really cool things inside. But one of the things that we talked about was the economics of it. Yeah. And the economics of it worked because more than 50% of it was subsidized by the government to be there. Otherwise, it wouldn't make enough electricity to warrant its cost. Yeah. So the big thing, and I'm curious if you guys noticed this, because there was more than what the movie talked about, was the glaring omission of what the movie didn't talk about.
Right.
And when it comes to renewable energies, it seemed odd to me. They kept focusing on these three major ones. They focused on biomass, wind, and solar. But there's a fourth, far better technology available that it pretended that doesn't even exist in the world. It was mentioned in passing once or twice, I think. And that's nuclear. This movie went so far out of its way to pretend that those types of energy don't even exist. That it's not even something that's on the table. And it's probably, in our generation, in our era, one of the safest and one of the most cost-effective ways that we could produce energy. And leftists just ignore it entirely. It doesn't exist in their world.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly frustrating because as someone who does care about the environment, why are we not talking about this? Like, this isn't 1970s. Like, the technology is considerably different and considerably better. The likelihood of a Chernobyl level thing is pretty nil. And I hate to say it, we kind of survived that too, even as awful as that was.
Well, let me come straight at you as an ANCAP then on that one, on the nuclear. Sorry, Anthony, just to it. My main objection to it, I suppose, as a libertarian and a free marketeer, is the only way, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong in this, the industry, the nuclear industry, won't get rid of its own shit. They expect the government to do it for them. And also, no private insurance company will underwrite it, so it falls on the taxpayer to underwrite it and insure it. Are my impressions false there, or?
I'm gonna be honest. I'm not entirely sure.
Okay.
Those are good questions.
Yeah.
That being
free
said,
market.
No, absolutely, and that's, I'm not against asking questions. Even when it comes to the wind and the solar, I'm not saying that those technologies won't ever be there. Like, I'm not saying that they can't be created. The issue is when it's so heavily subsidized by government to try and produce them. I think that they'll be useful when they're useful based on human ingenuity, when it tackles those problems that it's able to tackle. Right. No amount of government money ever seems to make things happen faster, in my experience. Yes. It happens when they happen.
There's this idea that if you subsidize an industry, you're going to promote that industry, but like most government programs, it can have the complete opposite effect, right?
Yeah.
Because you're paying them to be inefficient. If they actually have to meet the market standards to be efficient, there's more of an incentive there to improve the technology so you can make a profit out of it. Of course, all forms of energy have received massive subsidies, including the fossil fuel industry.
And that's where I was going next.
It was built on, the nuclear industry was absolutely built on government subsidies at the beginning. So, but there's quite a few points
but then that would tend to contradict what you just said previously in terms of.
Oh, I mean, initially, I don't know how much it goes on, but I mean, they wanted to get it on the ground because they wanted to offset the cost of getting weapons grade materials to make nuclear bombs.
It was an afterthought, really. Energy was an afterthought to the weapon.
You're right. Yeah. So there's quite a few questions that I want to put to Nick. Right. One of them is.
Well, real quick, I don't want to finish up here. So, real quick, the big thing is, so you can talk about subsidization, but I don't want to ignore the fact that the largest army that has ever existed on planet Earth is required to protect all those oil fields out in the Middle East. And let's not ignore that in the cost equation of how much the fossil fuel industry is subsidized. We have literally no idea what it would cost to produce fossil fuels because of how much money the entire world order maintained to keep it working is cost to my country in particular. So I just want to make sure I get that in there.
That's very true. You know, we're at the mercy of oil cartels that could be broken up, and you know, it could be a lot more efficient, a lot cheaper and cleaner to extract oil, coal, and gas if we didn't have these government-backed monopolies.
Mm-hmm. So sorry about Anthony. I just want to make sure I finished.
No, sorry.
Yeah. So what we're saying is basically you need a free market to be able to see the relative costs and benefits of each of these different kinds of energy, and all these interventions into the economy just blur the lines and make it impossible for us to see truth from falsehood when it comes to how we should be providing our own energy. So one of the major criticisms leveled at solar power that I agree with is it seems to take tons and tons of room. The cost has been coming down and the efficiency has been going up. But what I'm really interested to hear, Nick, is what are your thoughts on these solar powered roof tiles? Because they obviously aren't going to take any more extra space, whereas big fields of solar panels do. Can you see them being useful?
100%. Like those are the kind of technologies I actually like. Like I said, I'm not against these technologies to be against these technologies. I just don't think they're ready yet. Like it's the idea of trying to force them to take over when they're not prepared to take over. I absolutely say given another 50 to 100 years, maybe sooner, like those technologies can be made viable. They're going to be made smaller. They're going to, like, for all I know, 50 years from now, we're going to have a coat of paint you can slap on the outside of your giant concrete building that turns your entire building into one giant solar panel. But we're not there yet. We're there where we're still running, like you said, 15 to 20% efficiency on things. I think that I personally, I'd rather see our roofs made into gardens than solar farms, but that's a thing I'd rather see.
Right, but here the interesting thing is we can tell the technology is not there. This is something that the left don't understand because people haven't adopted it. It's like if I knew that I could put solar panel tiles on my roof and it was going to eliminate my electricity bill or even get me a bit of money, not only would I do it, and when I say I mean anyone, not only would people start doing it, they'd be going around to their neighbors shouting about it. Do you know what I mean? It's obviously not there because it's not been widely adopted yet. Tell me if I'm wrong.
No, on net you're correct, but let's not pretend some of the games that aren't played by giant corporations that have monopolist industries, where they'll buy up technologies and then hide them. Like if you watch that Need to Grow documentary we talked about, and like look at that green powerhouse and what that thing managed to do, and then how it burned in a fire. A building full of water. Meanwhile, the furnace is still standing and looks untouched next to it. I'm not saying that someone, had a vested interest to make sure that technology never comes out, but we know people have a vested interest to make sure the technologies don't come out and shit happens.
Yeah.
I
Okay,
think
that's a valid point.
I think that there's a lot of technologies that may not ever see the light of day, even if they are useful. The minute the main population gets out and realizes that, I think you're absolutely right. But there's a heck of a market incentive to keep those technologies from ever getting to that point. So, you know, I as much as I'm against subsidizing green energy, you said, I'm very much against subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, propping that up, which I think we still do. So the big thing is we don't have any idea what any of the energy we use costs because it's so intertwined into other costs of our culture, and it's very frustrating for me. You may be right. You know, technically in a free market, that is exactly how that would happen,
Right, okay.
but we don't have it.
Okay, well, that's a very valid point. So could you tell us a little bit, since you touched upon it already, how nuclear energy has evolved since the days of Chernobyl, and even comment on the explosion that happened in Fukushima?
I'm going to be honest. Fukushima scares the hell out of me, and I'm not as educated on it as I want to be. I remember when it happened, and then I remember how we just stopped talking about the fact that we've done nothing about it. It's been leaking nuclear waste into our oceans for, what's it been now? Almost 10 years. That terrifies me. What I will say is, to a degree, the world seems to have gone on. So you have to wonder about how damaging all these things that they've told us to be terrified are. Maybe they are damaging us more than we have. You know, we still really haven't seen, is my generation all going to die of cancer? You know, is that how it's
Right.
going to work?
Can you comment on why they build those nuclear reactors on a fault line? There is actually a reason for it, because a layperson would say, why are you building that where there's likely to be earthquakes and volcanoes? That's crazy. But actually it's something to do with the way they cool the reactors or something like that.
Well, I mean, that's the reason they built them on the ocean. I know that because they have all that water ready and available to get to the reactors and cool them. They don't need to pump it in. It's just right
Okay.
there. That's the way I understood it. But the thing to understand is that we're also talking about reactors that should have been decommissioned many years ago. They're about 3 generations outdated when they actually had the issues. So, like, they were the top of the line technology back in like the 1970s, and then had not updated any of their systems like as the technology became available. Like, they were a solid 30 years behind all of the technology that's powering France right now, because France, from what I understand, is way up on the nuclear, and they've been safely using it for decades now, and I believe it does produce a large portion of their energy in their country, because
not
they are
just
so
theirs, the
concerned with green
export.
technology.
You know,
Yeah.
Britain, in fact, takes a lot of energy from France. So while we slap ourselves on the back for going terribly green, we are, in fact, importing energy from huge oil-consuming nations like Russia and from nuclear nations like France, you know, which is not widely publicized, but it's what we do. And I think even Germany was in the process of shutting down its nuclear reactors, but I think is now considering reactivating them. But as I understand it, there's 3 major nuclear disasters that everybody talks about. Chernobyl is obviously the very worst and the biggest of them all. There's the Fukushima one, and there's also, is it 3 Mile Island in the US? But 3 Mile Island was, there's no deaths involved whatsoever in that, as far as I know, not in the first instance. Maybe people died years later, I have no idea. And then the Fukushima one, was there any actual deaths in Fukushima, or was the death rate minimal? I don't know.
Fukushima, from what I understand, it had a cost on the surrounding areas. And I don't think it was like anyone immediately dying. I think there is a lot of people are going to die prematurely because of it.
Yeah.
That's the way I understand that.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to point out like the massive government involvement in all of these projects, probably the most of which would be, you know, Chernobyl. Which, and if anybody's not watched that documentary or the film that they did about it, it's a really, really engaging film. I recommend checking it out. It's a little depressing, but if you're on the fence about how much you like governments, let me tell you, you won't be afterwards.
Yeah, but we know that wasn't real communism. It wasn't real socialism. You know,
And God forgive us if we ever saw that.
Government, that would never have happened. Yeah.
What we saw was real people reacting the way real people do with real incentives.
Yep. So it seems to me there's a lot of wishful thinking amongst critics. You know, they want green energy, what's called green energy, but turns out not to be green energy. They want these renewables like wind and solar to be more efficient, to be efficient enough to power us. And to be honest, I want that too. I like the idea of us being able to live in harmony with nature. I don't know if global warming is man-made. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of the idea that the Earth cannot adapt to absorb the extra carbon, because from what I'm seeing, you know, trees love carbon and they pump it into greenhouses.
We seem to be doing really good here on Earth with all that carbon in there. A lot better than we were doing 100 years ago or 200 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, that's we've got a lot more rich over those last 200 years. I believe in technology, and I believe that if there's going to be solutions, I know a lot of people in the green movement are like, oh, they just want more technological solutions to problems that are created by technology. And I'm like, dude, that's how like civilization has worked always, right?
So,
you know, we started fishing and that was great, but then we fished too many fish, so we needed to learn to do something else. Everything we do creates problems, and human ingenuity has the ability to react to those problems. And I just think that is the force of life. That is the force of the universe. That's how evolution operates. You know, it adapts.
And 100%, that is literally the entire premise of Free Market's Green Earth. It's to point out the fact that human ingenuity seems to have done really, really good so far. And the thing is, it just doesn't deal with problems before it needs to deal with problems, because that's how human beings work. I've heaped a lot of praises on this movie, obviously, but I do want to push back. And the pushback that I personally will give is, so when you're talking to these people, and they give you these dire, horrible, oh my God, humanity is going to end. And then the question I ask is, do you think humanity is capable of doing so much damage to the planet that it doesn't bounce back? Like, do you think that we're even remotely capable of doing that? Or do you think that we'll kill ourselves off for whatever way we do, and then eventually nature will do what nature does, and everything will...
We're not going to turn... We're not going to... We're not going to turn planet Earth into Venus, you know, no matter how much carbon we put into the atmosphere.
Exactly.
So, but what would you say?
So why not let us see how far we can go? Why do we? If the end result is us dead either way, let's not. Why don't we see how great we can make it for us before that happens?
What do you say to people who would say, but Nick, you say, you know, human ingenuity doesn't respond to these problems unless it has to, but that's a bug, not a feature, because you know we don't see like if someone holds a knife to your throat, you see the immediate threat, but if it's like vaguely sometime off in the distance, 20-30 years from now, then people don't respond to that, but they need to, because we need to take action now.
I say it's horseshit. Absolute and utter horseshit, because if you look at any first world industrializing nation, we've all gotten better at this. We've invented things to put on our smokestacks. Granted, they make products more expensive, but they make it so we don't have to pump our fucking skies full of carbon. Like these things exist. You look at things like the green power plant out there, which turns its carbon from biomass into, carbon that goes into your soil where it belongs to help grow your plants. That one in particular I love, because one of my big sticking points is just what the fossil fuel industry has done to our soil, because that is something I do see as being a real problem, being exasperated by huge monopolies created by our government. I freak out about like how we should be doing our farming industry differently, but I'm not going to sit here and say, like, anything that we would do to change the farming industry, short of, wanting to kill a ton of people, like, we can't just make farming less productive. We have to do it in a way that's going to allow people to thrive. I'm not Bill Gates out here saying, we need the whole population of the world to shrink. Clearly, the world has managed to survive the population, and when it stops being able to produce enough, we'll stop procreating because there won't be enough food for us. The same way it happens to a deer population out in the middle of New York State. The same way it happens to any other animal in the environment. And that's one of the things that I find ridiculous is that, like, especially when you talk to the left, they have these two positions that they want to completely ignore, and they kind of want to ignore the fact that they'll sit there and talk like we're part of nature and how we're going to affect nature, but they want to ignore how we're part of nature when every other species functions exactly like we do. It grows until its food source is not able to sustain itself. Yeah. Like, that's how every other animal population works, and they freak out. Like, it's just frustrating because it's hard to follow any train of logic because there kind of isn't one.
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. The logic is we have this feeling that we're doing something terrible to the planet, and I want that feeling to go away. And the only way is to say, why doesn't the government do something about it? And I mean, I think it's psychological. I mean, for myself, I still notice, when I was kind of like, my mum grew up really poor, right? So she had this thing about not throwing things away and not wasting things. And, but the thing is, she'd make exceptions wherever it was suited her. So typical of it. But the thing is, it really...
Of your mum or just women in general?
Well, I'll leave that to the discretion of the audience because it was deliberately ambiguous. But the stressfulness of being able to be chided, by my mum for any time for not doing something right, entered me, and I started to apply it consistently. And I didn't want to take out tin foil to put it in the oven because it would be a waste of tin foil. And when I was in university, even though I don't think there's anything wrong with this, but I mean, it's not going to save the world. I'd write all of my notes on scrap paper that people printed out in error because they, in the library, and I just wrote my notes on the back of it. I still do it, actually. I'd grab napkins off tables and shops and cafes, if someone had just abandoned them so as not to waste them. So it entered me psychologically. And even though I recognize that this is like psychologically motivated, it's hard to like click yourself out of it. To the degree that it's not hurting anyone, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with saving not used napkins, but so that they don't get wasted. But when you think about the fact that one pizzeria is wasting more cardboard boxes and napkins every day than than if you did that your whole life, you would save. It kind of puts your impact as an individual into perspective, which is why
we use our pizza boxes in our garden. So
great. You use that to compost?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, my wife's been doing what I think is called a lasagna gardening to help recreate the soil in our backyard. You do a layer of cardboard. Brilliant. It kills the grasses underneath it, and then you put on, the compost as you get it. And eventually that cardboard's just more carbon in the ground.
Oh man, so, I just took 2 pizza boxes out to the blue bin this morning. I should have brought them over to my dad's house for his garden.
I want you to think about what you just said, and this is one of the things that, like, you and me, and I presume Tom, we're probably the worst, man. We're these hardcore capitalists over here. We are big business loving, hardcore capitalists.
Yeah. And we wipe our ass in $100 bills and light up cigars with fucking, yeah.
Do you know why I love shopping in Primark so much? I just like to know that my £3 slippers were made by the blood, sweat, and tears of starving Indonesian children. It just makes them so much more comfortable to wear.
Don't even get me started, Anthony. We're gonna have to have you on Peace Freak so we can talk about your episode on capitalists the other day. Okay. But my point being is that so we're supposed to be those people that don't care about the environment, that don't care about any of this. And yet here we are having a discussion about specifically that. And I don't think at any point in here one of you guys has said, fuck nature, we're gonna pave the entire damn thing. That's not a discussion
I do
any
suspect that
person's
Tam
having.
secretly thinks it, though. I do think.
No, but what I don't, what I dislike is Gaia worship, right? I don't like this idea that, look, Mother Nature is a fucking cunt, okay? It's not
she hates us.
It's not this benign thing, okay? Bubonic plague, this idea that things that are man-made are bad and things that are natural are good.
Well, right there,
bubonic plague is completely natural, you know.
Well, you're giving into them already. I'm going to tell you this: you're already giving them more credit than they deserve.
Right.
The whole idea of anything "quote unquote" natural versus unnatural. We did an episode way back when we started Free Market Screen Earth about this.
Okay.
Called the most dangerous invasive species.
Right.
You know, dun dun dun, man. Why is anything that human beings do unnatural?
I've said this.
We are an animal that goes out and recreates our environment as best we can to be more suitable for us. Now, granted, we're really, really good at it, better than anything in history ever seems to have been. But why is it that we get to declare what we do, doing a process that every other creature does? Why is it unnatural when we do it versus...
This was the point I was going to make. There is absolutely nothing unnatural about 6 lanes of freeway. It's what we do. There is no difference in my mind between us building a suspension bridge and a beaver building a dam.
Exactly.
You know, it's what, you know, or a bird building a nest.
A beaver doesn't even have the ability to consider the externalities to its environment of building in a dam, whereas humans are actually starting to think, oh, should we really be doing this, and trying to assess things. Now, they may err, and usually when government gets involved, it fudges the incentives and encourages us to err. But in a state of nature, we are likely to want to consider the wider consequences of what we do, especially when we're wealthy. When we're in poor countries, you just do whatever you need to do to survive. People come to me all the time and say, oh, well, what about when they chop down the Brazilian rainforest? Well, for one thing, what the fuck else are Brazilian people going to do to make money other than cut down the rainforest? Because they don't have a free economy where they can make money by trading and building up other industries compared to relatively developed nations.
Well, what I would argue in that case is, are Brazilian people cutting down their forests, or are large multinational corporations cutting down their forests, whether or not they give a damn?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Those are things that I think are important. Like, let's not get it twisted. That's a whole lot of non-voluntary human interaction there that, like, I would like to do away with.
That's the other side of the coin, which is that these are countries where they don't have strict respect for property rights. Yeah. So even if a charity wanted to go into Brazil and say, right, we've got tons of donations, we're going to buy up the Amazon and not cut it down, they wouldn't. The government would still sell off the logging rights after the charity bought the land. That's why they don't do it.
Well, a lot of this land as well, maybe not as much as on the fossil fuel side of things, but as that documentary demonstrated as well, that, you know, much of this land is being cleared for biofuels and biomass. You know, like stuff, sugar cane. Sugar beets, you know, there's I don't think there's anything that will deplete a soil in the way that sugar beet will, because you can't grow jack shit in there for a few years after you've grown sugar beet because it depletes the soil quality so much.
You keep saying sugar like it's not one of the most subsidized things in the world. My government, like, there's so much fucking money into sugar, it's insane.
And all that government money for corn ethanol, which was completely inefficient as well. And
why are we subsidizing sugar yet at the same time telling people it's bad and taxing it? What's the point of subsidizing it on the one hand and then taxing it on the other? Why not just stop subsidizing it, and that will force them to look for alternatives?
Well, don't go making sense there, Tam.
Well, the thing is, it totally makes no sense if you don't understand public choice theory as a branch of economics, because there's a group of people who benefit for the subsidies and fight to defend their subsidies, and there's another group that wants to tax it, that fight to tax it. So, flippant. The other side of the coin of what you mentioned about sugar beets is one thing that I always found really interesting, which is industrial hemp is illegal. And the industrial hemp is the opposite of sugar beets. It improves the soil. And a lot of the time when forests have been cut down, what they say is a good thing is to grow industrial hemp for a few years and then start replanting the trees because they'll grow better. It's also one of the fastest CO2 to biomass converters. So if they really believed in reducing the carbon in the air, then they'd legalize industrial hemp. It can take the carbon out of the air, then you can process it into oil and rope and paper and all sorts of things. But we're not allowed to do that.
Well, you move, see, and that's one of the things that makes this even more complicated is just because you're following human incentives. I'm going to be honest, I don't know any lefty that wouldn't be completely ecstatic about growing hemp.
Right.
So now we're getting into the fact that there are differences in what governments
industries
desire, and what people want.
So let me ask you a question. Can you comment a little bit more on biomass and its coverage in the film and anything that you know that we don't, basically? Teach us.
Well, it's honestly, biomass is not something that I paid a whole lot of attention to prior to this movie. I didn't realize that it was maybe as widespread as it is. So that was something that was really interesting to me. Was just I learned a heck of a lot more about that one. Usually, I focus on nuclear, and complain about the other two. So I think that so much of this movie was just weird in the omissions. And it happens like in the way the movie presented things, but it also happens in the fact that that's been almost omitted from my worldview, that I wasn't even aware that was going on to the degree it was.
Right.
So, and I think that's part of the issue that we face with all of this is that so much of this happens with people that we're not privy to those conversations. Like most people don't think about how their power is generated. They just think that, hey, my shit lights up when I want it to light up.
Mm-hmm.
And, even as somebody who's really interested in the topic and follows it to a degree, that was kind of completely a blind spot to me. So it means they're really not talking about that one. And yet it's kind of in the background behind all of this, apparently.
But it seems like it has been roundly criticized by the environmental movement as well. I was on the Wikipedia page chat, and there was a line on the Wikipedia page for this movie that said it has been widely criticized for its inaccuracies that had no footnotes at all, whereas the previous line that said something else had 3 footnotes. And I went on the talk page and I said, this is just prejudice. You can't, throw a line in there without footnoting it. But those people, they're always the people who are like members of their local skeptic society, the people who are skeptical about everything except for their own dogmas. And they just dominate you. The person who put the line in is somewhere high up in the Wikipedia food chain, and there's no objectivity to it. But one thing it did say is it's been noted for its fair criticisms of biomass. So those kind of more mainstream intellectuals seem to think that its criticisms of biomass are valid. Sorry there, Nick.
Well, there's actually there's a point I want to bring out that it really shows the cognitive dissonance of the director. In the very beginning of the movie, he talks specifically about how excited he was to create his home out in the hills and be completely disconnected from everything, and how he, would completely heat his home by wood. And yet we get to the 2/3 of the way through the movie, and he's railing against using trees for energy.
That's interesting.
And not noticing that, but what you were choosing to do living out in your home was burn trees for energy. Your home was made out of trees. Like they never make that connect that the whole thing is about energy, and it doesn't matter if you're burning it to heat yourself, which is, by the way, incredibly fucking inefficient.
Yeah, that's what I was just
Yeah.
thinking. I'm sure when they burn a tree in a biomass converter, they try and suck every little um se- bloody hell, I can't even remember, joule of energy they can out of it. Whereas if you just do it in your fireplace, you're not going to burn it efficiently. So they will be more efficient. I did not love seeing those stacks and stacks of trees being felled and thrown into it, though I have to admit.
Well,
Um, but but yeah, sorry, go on,
yeah,
Tam.
this is another. I mean, it was defined earlier as horse shit. At least horse shit can be used as manure. I think it's worse than that. It's dog shit. It's completely toxic as well. You know, to come out and say somehow, okay, if a tree falls over and
In the
dies,
forest, does
and
it make a
and Michael
sound?
Moore's not there to make a documentary about it. No, if it falls over, dies, goes into the ground, fossilizes for a few thousand years, then we dig it up and burn it incrementally so that it releases its energy a lot slower and you can burn little pieces of it for longer. That's bad. But if you chop the same tree down and just burn it, that's good.
Well, there is a rationale for that.
Okay, go for it.
I'm not saying it, well, what they're saying is the trees are basically part of the regular carbon cycle anyway, whereas when you take the coal, you're taking ancient fuel that's not part of the cycle going round and round quickly. And um, if you believe in the global warming hypothesis, that stands to reason from their worldview that that would be worse.
Still sounds like dog shit to me, but
So,
then I'm not an expert.
so I want to give you some homework here, Tam.
Okay.
I want you to go and I want you to look up the Need to Grow documentary.
Okay.
And the reason, like, it's interesting that they kind of came out in a similar time to me, or at least that I discovered them in a similar time. The whole documentary is about this the green powerhouse I've mentioned a couple times, and essentially it's a closed system where it burns biomass. Like, that's what it does. Okay. Now it burns that biomass, but as opposed to releasing it into the air, it releases the carbon straight into an algae system.
That's cool as fuck.
And so the idea when they're doing the documentary, and you know, please, if people know more about this, that you want to contact me, absolutely do. I'm always about learning, but it definitely confirms my biases about technology, because the idea behind the whole project is that he's created a closed system, and they ask him, so what you're doing is essentially 400 years worth of work by burning the biomass and then getting it back in the carbon, because you're getting it back in the ground, because that's the problem. It's not the fact that we have a system where we burn carbon. It's the fact that we throw it into the air as opposed to putting it back into the soil. So if you find a way to do that by getting it back into the soil, say the technology this guy invented, that's a game changer. Like, that makes things so much different in our for us, for everything. Like, that's a way. Okay, so if we now have a way to generate power and help reinforce our soil kind of all in the same thing, then why wouldn't we be doing that? So
yeah, that sounds awesome. So one thing is, you said the guy said how excited he was to move to this home where he'd be self-sufficient and burn fire to heat it and stuff like that. And I have to say, at no point during the documentary did he ever sound excited about anything. If there's one thing the critics really got right about this documentary, is he had a boring ass voice. He didn't even try. And clearly,
I thought that at first, but I got used to it.
Well, the thing is, I just wonder why no one on the team said, dude, can you put a little bit of color into your narration? Like, why don't you use several pitches with your voice and make it sound interesting?
Maybe he just tried to sound authentic, you know.
Well, he sounded authentically boring as fuck.
Don't you preach the Stoics here, brah? Come on. Like,
Me?
you know you got to hate for someone that's managed to keep their emotions in check?
Well, yeah, I've learned a lot about...
What kind of therapist are you?
I've learned a lot about the use of my voice. And
would you rather he be manic and freaking out?
Yeah. Would you want to be
times.
a children's television presenter?
Here,
honk horns every couple of minutes.
But I mean, watching the documentary, we all know exactly why he managed to keep that measured tone, because he wanted to come off as sounding serious with a dire message, because his message is humanity is fucked,
right?
And he wants to impart that to you by sounding as if, you know,
he's
he
going
really
to sleep.
Yeah, well,
right.
Yeah, but I mean, I think I got used to the guy's voice. I kind of found him quite likable. I liked
Me
how,
too, but he was
and
still
I
boring.
think it demonstrated as well how those people in the environmentalist movement do not like to answer awkward questions. They really don't like it. You know, it's when you question the orthodoxy, when you question what is in effect, and they made this point in the documentary, when you question what is in effect their religion, you know, their Gaia worshiping bullshit, they don't like it, you know, and they attack.
I want to pick up on a couple of points. One of them is, even supposing the worst was true and this documentary, the technologies they were displaying were 10 to 20 years out of date, it doesn't get away from the fact that they wasted a ridiculous amount of resource. They want to say that, oh yeah, but the technology is 10 or 20 years out of date, as though that's the thing.
Is it 100% efficiency yet?
Yeah.
That's all you have to ask.
That's
no?
basically,
okay, that doesn't make any difference. It's still
yeah,
true
it's
in
like,
kind.
it's basically like, oh yeah, but that technology's out of date. And it's like, so what? You're saying that this industry has been trumpeted for 20, 30 years as environmentally friendly when it was clearly a complete waste of resources. So yeah, I'm happy if solar panels make more energy with less space and less materials. There's one point on the intermittency of it. Well, so one of the things is, because we have an electrical grid, companies aren't allowed to charge you more money for energy during those times where it's peak use.
Yeah.
They have to charge you the same time, the same amount, right? That's one thing. That's one market incentive that would help to deal with the intermittency issues. If you had to pay more for your electricity depending on when you used it, you know, people would put their washing machines and charge their phones and things at night, and then that would be less of an issue for. I'm not saying that it would make wind suddenly viable, but at least it would tip the scales in a way that environmentalists want. I don't hear them talking about that. And I just wanted to mention another thing about
just to be clear,
yeah, go on.
There are other wind technologies that haven't been adopted, haven't reached mass market viability yet, that are far superior as far as like generating purposes. Like the giant space consuming method that we've used so far is most likely not the one that would ever be used. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the vertical towers as opposed to the ones that have the actual giant windmill thing. Like I've seen ones that like literally they function by vibrating the tower itself.
Wow.
And that's what there are technologies out there that show promise. The point is that forcing them before they're ready doesn't do any good.
Right.
Yeah. You know, and we need to be able to see, like, throwing millions of dollars to subsidize these industries throws off that cost, the cost schedule. Throws off our ability to do a cost benefit analysis, because we're not bearing that burden in a way that we can see. Anytime that we hide the costs means that we don't see the big picture. And that's why I'll say take away subsidies for absolutely everything, so that we can see what our shit actually costs.
Yes.
You know, we might make a different decision. We may sit and we may completely eat our words and say, you know what? When we actually look at all the things that go into subsidizing oil, it's just not worth it. We probably should focus on some of these technologies, because, you know, what it costs to keep all those big military ships floating around in the South China Sea costs too much. You know, all those people that we have to keep over in the Middle East, that makes that cost too much to bear. But we don't. But because we can't show that equation, it's too complicated an equation. We can't get down to the real core of it. We can't do a simple cost benefit analysis because there's too many costs that we're forced to pay that we don't know about.
Yeah, that's a good word. And I just wanted to make one point on that. The documentary was very critical of replacing coal with natural gas. Now, I do think it's not quite clear if natural gas is less CO2. What the fuck is the word, man? What is wrong with me today?
The word's
I
up.
don't know if natural gas produces less CO2 than coal does, but it does look like, you know, it doesn't include particulate matter. Like, so you're not getting the mercury or nitrous dioxide or sulfur dioxide that tends to come with coal. Actually, a step in the direction of natural gas is a step in the direction of all the ways that if you read books like the Rational Optimist and such like that have been coming out in the last decade about the progress that have been made, they're all keen to cover the ways in which our air and water are getting less polluted. And in many ways, you know, our green cover in Europe and America has massively increased. There's lots of good things going on in the environment. We're exposed to less environmental toxins in many ways. And so I just wanted to know if you had any comments on natural gas.
See, for me, the way that I think about all this stuff is that you have to allow people the choices to make the choice they're going to be. You know, maybe that's the right choice for somebody else. If you have a natural gas reserve in your own country, and you don't have to ship in giant tankers utilizing fossil fuels to get you, you know, oil or coal or whatever it is that you're going to burn instead, it may be 2 or 3 levels of you know, better for the environment. This, like, people don't think about the cost of transportation. Like, if you can take transportation out of the equation, like, that's what makes things, you know, that's something that just people just don't really factor into the equation. So, like, say I'm sitting on a natural gas deposit, and I'm not going to burn, you know, as much fuel as it takes to get it to me as I'm going to, you know, versus the alternative. Then that's the way to do it. And that's one of those things that, like, they take as a given in this, is that what's good for everyone is all one thing.
Yeah.
And any market will tell you that that's not the case. Like, it's, you know, I guess that's, maybe you could get into the macro of, like, that's just a problem with the left in general, is there has to be one answer for everything.
Yeah.
And there just isn't.
Yeah, the documentary makes certain assumptions as givens. You know, one, it makes obviously the assumption that climate change, global warming, is man-made and it's catastrophic. It makes that assumption, and it also makes the assumption that all fossil fuels, be it gas, coal, oil, are all innately bad, and we have to get rid of them. It doesn't even explore the concept that we could make these fuels that are problematic incredibly more efficient and incredibly cleaner, you know. And as you've mentioned, nuclear, I don't know what you know about thorium. I've heard some people say thorium's viable, you know, we're just not there yet. And then there's other people say, look, you'll never make thorium viable. I really have no idea on that one. But yeah, the movie makes certain assumptions that it never really backs up.
Well, to say that something would never be viable is the most insane thing you can possibly say. The point is that if you have the resources and you want to test something, why in the world wouldn't they let you test it? Like, people that want to stop innovation scare me far more than, you know, somebody messing up, I guess. Yeah. You know, humanity's pretty good at cleaning up its messes.
Yeah.
One thing that you did say, that, because you're talking about global warming, and this is something that the way that people talk about it and the things that they take for given really, really affect what the way that the discourse works.
Yeah.
So people take it as a given. Like, we'll talk about the things that are going on in the ocean, and everyone is told that, well, global warming is killing the oceans, completely ignoring that probably what's going on in the oceans is all of the runoff from every single river on the planet, from all of the industrial waste from our farming apparatus. If the pH of your ocean is off, I tend to think it has less to do with absorbed carbon from the air than it does from all of the petrochemicals that we pump into it at an industrial level.
Okay.
But no one talks about those issues. They talk as if our oceans are screwed up because of global warming, because people don't think about, like, because basically you're giving your marching orders about what you're allowed to talk about. Yeah. And it's incredibly frustrating that you can't step out of, hegemony with any other kind of,
One of the frustrations that I had with the environmental movement when I was kind of moving in this direction, because I used to write quite a lot of stuff on free market environmentalism, was the fact that and maybe even before I was a free marketeer, it seemed like they would speak about global warming to the exclusion of all other environmental problems that existed. And if anything, it was like a Trojan horse, because there's things that we can more easily deal with if we have the consciousness to do so, but no one cares to spend their brain energy comprehending it and putting forward comprehensive solutions, because
I don't even think that's it. Let's face facts. There is a giant political organization out there that has a very specific plan of action that it wants, and it makes damn sure that we all know what our marching orders are to help fix the environment. I don't feel like I need to name said organization because it's, the biggest NGO in the world. But I'm being coy, folks. It's United Nations.
Yeah.
And they've given marching orders to every person on the planet of what they expect. That's what the Greta Thunbergs of the world are out there to do. They're there to make you buy into their particular way of fixing the earth. You're not allowed to deviate from their plan. It doesn't matter if you have a better idea or not, because they already had their idea. So go along with it. Get in line. Doesn't matter how many people are going to die because of their plan.
Sure.
Because of how expensive it would make energy for the world. But then again, maybe that's the real plan, is fewer people on the planet, because it seems to be the thing everybody's talking about these days. Let's just make the earth less populous.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people, they've come out the woodwork when it came to COVID, and saying this is a great thing, and obviously human beings are the real virus and all the rest of it. But could I ask you, Nick, what was your wake-up call? Or was there a Damascene moment for you, or was it just a gradual, what was your journey from being a tree-hugging? I'm sure you still hug trees, but you probably...
I still consider myself a tree hugger, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, what made you go from a tree-hugging lefty hippie to a tree-hugging... I was going to say a righty hippie, but I don't think that you necessarily consider yourself a tree-hugging libertarian hippie.
I mean, what's left or right mean, anyways?
Exactly.
I'm as socially liberal as they possibly come. So, for me, the big change in my life, or I guess the only thing that really changed in my life, is paying attention to economics. I stumbled onto the Tom Woods podcast and listen to those guys and things that always kind of seemed to not make sense about economics. All of a sudden started clicking, like, oh yeah, what's that about? And it's kind of like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know it's there, like, and you see that people, like the people that you paid attention to and listened to for years, are just ignoring like entire parts of science, entire parts of history, because it suits them to do so. You start looking at the world differently, and you say, well, sure, that's what you're saying, but where's the proof? And does somebody else have an alternative?
Right.
It seems like nobody wants the alternatives. They just want someone to give them the answer, and then, hey, we'll go along with it. Which, by the way, that's human nature. Like, it's on us to show people that there are other ways. So much of like creating the show for me was, I get sick of lefties feeling morally superior, when they're arguing.
I get sick of that.
Like, the fact of the matter is like, I want to make the world a better place for everybody. And I don't want to do it at the cost of third world countries. Can you say the same?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Nick, there's certainly no substitute for you. So if people... One more...
Yeah. Go on, Anthony.
No, I was going to close out the show.
Well, just briefly before we go. if there's people out there who stumble across this show and they're currently of the tree hugging left persuasion, I mean, if they haven't switched off by now, if there's some seeds of doubt in their mind and they're thinking, yeah, you know, I get that there's problems with the environmental movement, but I want to see some evidence. What would you recommend? Would you recommend, is there any particular book, obviously your own podcast would be a good start, but
Free Markets Green Earth is the name of the podcast.
I would say go to the libertyhippiepods.com.
Okay.
Because I present to you the entire libertarian perspective through the eyes of people that don't kind of fit into the normal binary spectrum. I created it. It's a bunch of shows handpicked specifically for, I guess, the hippie mentality. You know, we've got a show about the medical benefits of marijuana. It's got a Free Markets Green Earth is in the feed. Okay. My own show, Peace Freaks, which is more of a socially left kind of libertarian show. The idea is I wanted to create is to kind of be a soft landing for people that do come in from the left and say, hey, it's not all crazy right-wing former Republicans, because that was never me.
Well, I would have fitted right in 4 or 5 years ago, but enough time with Tam has turned me misanthrope, and I'm no longer a liberty hippie, but a liberty.
I mean, you could fool me with your episode talking about how we need to go and kill all the industrialists 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. But whatever. We'll address that when we address it.
We will
kill them humanely. Well, maybe. And is there a particular book that you've read that you were impressed with in terms of that kind of?
Come on, man! I'm in my mid-30s. I grew up on YouTube. Who the hell reads books anymore?
Yeah. Okay.
I'm saying that there isn't really as far as I can see, there isn't a really great recent libertarian introduction to libertarian environmentalism, as far as I can see. I picked up some older books, and there's some things that are tangential.
Wildly outdated.
There's some stuff that there's bits of books like Healing Our World by Mary Ruart, but it's only a couple of chapters. You know, I think that is a gap that needs to be filled. I've started my work.
Does The Rational Optimist touch on it at all?
Yes, definitely The Rational Optimist. There's a book called Abundance by a guy called Diamandis. It's more than 10 years old now, so a lot of the stuff there will be outdated. But it goes through lots and lots of technologies.
I know he's updating his book.
All right, that's cool. Abundance goes through tons of technologies that may be in the horizon that would significantly reduce our resource usage while being better for the environment. But the funny thing is, it's more than 10 years old, and a lot of them haven't emerged yet. So what does that say for
just for the record, we naturally reduce our resource usage on a per item basis, because if we can cut costs on how we produce it, of course we're going to. It's going to happen innately. I think
the book More from Less just recently came out. That's all about that, how we've reduced our resource usage. You can check out the author on YouTube.
I mean, you can read Steven Pinker. I mean, he's got stuff on that in his books where he's, trying to prove how much better the world is than it used to be. It's a very optimistic look at how much basically it breaks down by the numbers all of the things that people think are worse but are actually better about the world from where they were 50 years ago. The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels by Zach Epstein is a good book. Zach, I always kind of take with a...
It's Alex, isn't it?
Or Alex, sorry, Alex Epstein. Sorry. I always kind of take him with a grain of salt just because I realize he is a product of the energy industry.
Yes.
And so, it's with anything. Pay attention to who's saying what, because what's their agenda? What's the point? I would encourage you to do the same things about me. Pay attention to what my motivations are. I make no bones about it. For me, I just think that human ingenuity presents opportunities that focusing on the destructive power of humans.
But you're just secretly on the pay of human genius, of
you're
human
just
ingenuity.
You can't hide all that money the fossil fuel industry and the nuclear industry.
God, I would love it if they'd start sending me checks. That'd be great, please.
Well, Nick,
think about how I feel. I've got to go out and do a shitty job just to hide the fact that the fossil fuel industry is pumping all this money into my bank account.
I go out every day and could get shot at my job so that I can, shill for whoever I'm shilling for.
Right, well, Nick, you've been a fantastic and very qualified guest. It was great to learn some of your insights, and thanks for floating out the idea of doing a show on this documentary. A real pleasure to have you. If you want more free market environmentalism, you can find Free Markets Green Earth on your usual podcasting app. I did an episode with Nick on there, but you've probably, if you're a regular listener, already heard it on our feed. So, anything else to plug?
freemarketsgreenearth.com if you want the show notes and all the fancy stuff. Other than that, no, that's about it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, good to have you. And you too, Tam, even though you're co-host.